Hey guys, welcome back to the Tiny Maths channel, helping you with the little details that will improve your maths fast. Adding fractions with different denominators can seem really confusing at first. You know how to add fractions with the same denominator, similar fractions. That's easy. Just keep the denominator and add the two numerators. But look at these. These fractions are unlike fractions and therefore have different denominators. How do you add these kinds of fractions? Today we'll be learning how to add fractions with different denominators using the lowest common denominator method. Let's jump into an example we've used before, 1 over 2 plus 2 over 5. If you watch my last video with this example, you'll know that the fastest way to do this sum is by multiplying the two denominators, which gives you 10. You use that denominator for your answer. Then you cross multiply the numerators with the denominators of the opposite fraction. So you'll have 1 times 5 and 2 times 2, which gives you 5 and 4. You now add these numerators above your new denominator, so you have 5 plus 4 over 10, which is 9 over 10, and that's your final answer. But there's actually another way of doing this, and that's by finding the lowest common multiple of the two denominators. We call this number the lowest common denominator. Let's see what this does to our two fractions. First, list the first few multiples of the larger of the two denominators. In our example, 5, 10, 15, 20 and 25 are all multiples of the denominator 5. Then let's list the first few multiples of the other denominator. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22 are all multiples of the denominator 2. A common multiple is any number appearing on both lists, and the number 10 is an example. It is a multiple of both 2 and 5. We could also choose 20, but we're looking for the lowest common multiple, so we would normally choose 10, because it is the lowest number appearing on both lists. Eventually, you should be able to do this quite easily in your heads without having to write lists. Now this number 10 can be used as our lowest common denominator of both fractions. Here's what to do. For each denominator, ask, what must I multiply this denominator by to get the lowest common denominator? So for the first fraction, multiplying the denominator by 5 gives us 10, and for the second fraction, multiplying it by 2 gives us 10. But remember, in order for the value of the fraction to stay the same, if you multiply the denominator by a number, you must also multiply the numerator by that exact same number. We multiplied the first denominator by 5, so we must multiply the first numerator by 5. We multiplied the second denominator by 2, so we must multiply the second numerator by 2. Now let's write these results directly below our original fractions. So our first fraction becomes 5 over 10. And look, that's obviously a half, because if you have 10 things and you take 5, then you've taken 5 out of 10, which is half. Just another way of writing that is 1 over 2, so they are in fact the same fractions. And our second fraction becomes 4 over 10, which is equivalent to 2 over 5. Notice that we multiplied our fraction by 5 over 5, our first fraction by 5 over 5, and our second fraction by 2 over 2. Whenever a fraction has the same number for the numerator and the denominator, that fraction equals 1. So really, we're just multiplying the first fraction and the second fraction by 1. And anything you multiply by 1 remains the same value. So that's how we can be sure that our equivalent fractions are the same as the original fractions. I'd like to take this moment to apologise if you can hear screaming and shouting in the background. I live in a room in a big house shared by others who tend to be on the phone quite a lot. So if you hear any shouting and screaming in the background, it's them. They have these long conversations and I'm trying to record so that you don't hear them, but that's quite difficult. Sometimes I really feel like bashing on their door and telling them to shut up. Actually, why don't you bash the subscribe button, make a comment, hit the like button so that the channel can grow and more people can see these maths videos. Anyway, on with the lesson. Okay, now we can rewrite our whole sum then as 5/10 plus 4/10. Now our fractions have the same denominator, the lowest common denominator, 10. So we have similar fractions, and hopefully you remember what to do here. You keep the denominator and just add the numerators. So we get 5 plus 4/10, which is 9/10, and that's exactly the same answer as before when we used the other method of cross multiplication. Which method is better? Well, you probably don't want to use the first method when you have 3 or more fractions to add because things get quite confusing. It's better to improve at finding the lowest common denominator of 3 numbers or more and using that to find equivalent fractions than it is to try the cross multiplication method with 3 or more fractions. Now some of you might be thinking, why use the lowest common denominator in the first place? Do you have to use it? In our example we used 10, but as you saw, the number 20 was also a common denominator. It wasn't the lowest, but it is a multiple of both 2 and 5. Well, to see why we choose the lowest common denominator, let's use 20 as a common denominator for both fractions and we'll see what happens. Alright, since we're not using the lowest common denominator, but another common denominator, 20, for each of our original denominators, ask what must I multiply this denominator by to get the common denominator, 20. So, for the first fraction, multiplying the denominator 2 by 10 gives us 20, and for the second, multiplying the denominator 5 by 4 gives us 20. And again, you must also multiply the numerator by the exact same number that you multiplied the denominators by. The resulting equivalent fractions then are 10/20, which is obviously half, and 8/20. Adding them together gives 18/20. But have you noticed? We can simplify this fraction because we can divide the top and bottom numbers by 2. When we do that, we get 9/10, which is the same answer as before. And that's the difference between using the lowest common denominator and just any other common denominator. The reason why we had to do this last step of simplifying the fraction is because we didn't use the lowest common denominator. If we use it, then we will get the final result immediately. If we don't, then you'd have to simplify the fraction. Sometimes we call that reducing the fraction as well. So there it is. That's how you add fractions with different denominators and why it's usually best practice to use the lowest common denominator when doing so. Okay, I'm leaving you a bonus question just because you've been nice enough to stay to the end of the video. Here it is. 1/2 plus 2/5 plus 3/4. What does that equal? Well, now you have 3 fractions, all with different denominators. Can you solve this sum? Well, you should know how to find the lowest common multiple of 3 numbers and how to use that number, which we use as the lowest common denominator, to find equivalent fractions for these, which will all have the same denominator, making the sum easier to solve. And give it a try and leave a comment below if you think you found the answer. I'll let you know if you have. But if you want to see how I arrive at the answer in detail, you'll have to wait until the next video. As well as showing you how to solve this using the lowest common denominator, I'll also show you a trick for dealing with a sum like this if you're struggling to find the lowest common denominator. And it won't be too difficult to understand because you already have all the information you need to solve a problem like this. So have a try. Well, that's it for now. Happy solving. Take care. Until the next time.